So my name is Kendra Cheeseman, and today I'm going to be talking about some of my thesis research that I did in my Master of Landscape Architecture degree. And the title is Disability Walks in My Neighborhood and Experiencing the Urban Environment and Climate Crisis as a Person with Dysautonomia. So this screen shows a silhouette of a young woman who's overlooking the city of Hamilton, which is where this research takes place, in the neighborhood I live in called Kirkendall. So as Thea outlined, 1 in 5 Canadians have a disability, yet the built environment remains inaccessible, and that number is likely a lot higher than 1 in 5. And we do have some accessibility guidelines which aim to improve access, and that often focuses on people who are using mobility aids. And what this research that I did focuses on is looking at the design knowledge gap for accommodating folks who have sensory disabilities and autonomic disorders. And these disabilities in particular are impacted by weather that's related to our climate crisis, because the symptoms are impacted in a negative way by severe storms, for example. So this is called climate impacted illnesses and disabilities, which all people are impacted by weather changes, but folks who have autonomic disorders in particular have severe impacts. So for this research, I wanted to look at the interrelated factors of weather and design of the built environment, and how it can act as either a disabling force or be a point of connection for people who have dysautonomia. So I have an image here. It's a silhouette of a person that's saying like the individual condition, their identity, everything that they bring to the world, and their interactions with the built environment and society, and weather and climate crisis, and how all of these are linked together to create health and well-being. So the slide here, it goes over dysautonomia, and it says that dysautonomia can impact the whole body, and it lists the different organs that are impacted. So I won't go through all of the things, but the main takeaway is that dysautonomia is an umbrella set of conditions, and there are many different syndromes or conditions within that. So an example is postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome or orthostatic intolerance. And often folks who have a form of dysautonomia also have other overlapping conditions. So they might have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a condition that impacts the collagen in the body and other fine tissue. They might have gastrointestinal conditions such as IBS or Crohn's. There might also be autoimmune diseases and conditions too, like lupus or Lyme disease. And someone might also have mast cell conditions as well. So there's a lot of different automatic processes, autonomic disorders, that many folks take for granted. And if you have issues like temperature regulation, that's a part of dysautonomia, and then also regulating blood pressure and heart rate. So the objective for this research was to look at a review of existing recommendations for designing for chronically ill and disabled people. And I focused on landscape architecture and planning research. And then I also looked at universal design and policy regulations for accessibility in the built environment in southwestern Ontario, where the research took place. And then for myself, I wanted to look at my own experience of the built environment as someone with a form of dysautonomia. So I developed a walk-along interview tool, which basically just means what kind of questions can I ask myself about how I'm feeling as I go for a walk in my neighborhood, and what are the impacts of weather on my experience of the built environment and its design. and how that relates to the condition I have. And so what I did is I went on 6 walks through the built environment during different times of day and weather conditions, and I further refined this method. And I did this in August and September of 2019. And I then came up with some preliminary landscape design recommendations that can accommodate folks with dysautonomia based off of the climate in Hamilton, Ontario in August and September. So very preliminary look here. And so how I organized my research was I wanted to do a review of dysautonomia symptoms, and I focused on postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome and neurocardiogenic or vasovagal syncope, as those are the conditions I'm most familiar with and was a good jumping off point from a landscape architectural lens for me to understand, as well as my own identity and experience with those conditions, to look at that. And then I looked at medical and public health literature on how different weather conditions impact the body for everyone. And then I also wanted to look at how different weather conditions are increasing with our climate crisis in Southwestern Ontario. And so that was information from Environment Canada, as well as the IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change. And the findings from that is we're going to have more precipitation events and also flooding events, and also changes from freeze-thaw cycles. So what that means is you're going to have a hot day and then all of a sudden it's a cold day. And this is really more likely to occur in particular in the winter time, when what the climate has been doing prior to human-caused climate change is we used to have a constant freeze throughout the winter, and that would be pretty reliable, but that has changed. And then I also looked at what's called microclimate design and the best practices around that. And that's a really popular concept in the field of landscape architecture. And basically what it means is you have, like, let's say you have a courtyard, and maybe this courtyard is shaded because someone planted a tree there. Or maybe it's a courtyard that doesn't have any shade at all because no trees were planted. So if you have, let's say, unit pavers, like patio tiles throughout this courtyard, and the sun hits it and it's not shaded, then that's going to cause an increase in heat, and it's going to feel hotter, even on, let's say, a fairly cool day. So that's the microclimate. You can have an outside temperature, but there can be things in the environment and how we design it that can cause it to feel colder or warmer, or more or less humid, for example, or have a breeze or not. And so this is the research that I found on bodies and weather. So I'm going to go through quickly the different weather conditions, what a person's bodily response is in reaction to this weather, and then what a person's response is when they have dysautonomia. So starting with the weather condition of a low barometric pressure system. So this would be, you have a thunderstorm rolling in, or you have a precipitation event rolling in. That would be a low barometric pressure system coming in. Then the average person would have what's called vasodilation, or their blood vessels get bigger, and this lowers their blood pressure. Some people experience migraines because of this. And then for someone with dysautonomia, they have an exaggerated response. So their blood vessels get bigger, but they don't have a mechanism that helps their body increase their blood pressure in response to this change. So this can lead to fainting or syncope. When you have low blood pressure, and you don't have this response to help keep you getting your blood up to your brain, then you can get extreme fatigue from that as well, memory and word recall challenges. When we have high heat events, this can cause sweating and dehydration and heat stroke if you don't have the proper protection or ability to rehydrate, for example, no access to water. For someone with dysautonomia, they might have a poor sweat response or no sweat response or an exaggerated sweat response. And they also have temperature dysregulation as well. And this can lead to dehydration and low blood volume or hypovolemia, which is not good and can lead to syncope. And then cold temperatures, a person's response would be shivering or hypothermia if they're not protected. Again, for someone with dysautonomia, if they don't have temperature regulation, then they would have a poor shivering response. Little vasoconstriction to heat up the extremities, you know, when you're shivering and then you're able to warm up. And then this can also cause pain as well. And then a high barometric pressure system, that would be like, the sun's rolling in, yay. This often increases blood pressure. And this can actually be an issue for someone who has issues with high blood pressure, which some folks with dysautonomia do have. But this is also issues for folks who are at risk for stroke. And there was a study done that actually looked at increase in stroke or heart attacks because of high barometric pressure systems. And for folks with dysautonomia, you can actually have migraine and headaches in response to this, which is a little bit converse from low barometric pressure systems. And then lastly, what if there's high humidity? So we know that when there's high humidity, folks often are sweating more, they're dehydrated. Again, someone with dysautonomia, they have a poor sweat response and they might get dehydrated and have a lower blood volume. And of course, you can have a combination of these different weather events as well. So this is the theoretical lens that I took to my study. I look at disability rights and the right to access public spaces in the built environment, universal design, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. And then I also used my own experience as a disabled and chronically ill person who has a form of dysautonomia. And then I looked at wider ideas of health, disability well-being, and what are healthy built environments, and also what are ideas of health as it relates to community. So Armstrong Pretty did a fantastic thesis on indigenizing healthy built environments and what is our interdependence of each other as it relates to health. And I think that that is often vocalized within the disabled community as well, is the interdependence and our health and well-being. And so I did this research in my own neighborhood in Kirkendall, is the name of it, in Hamilton, Ontario. And I defined the neighborhood based off of what are the existing administrative boundaries, what are some natural boundaries, including some man-made boundaries such as the 5-lane highway of Main Street West to the north, and to the south you have Aberdeen Avenue, which is another busy road, and Queen Street to the east. I'm thinking directions right now. And then to the west you have Dundurn Street South. So these are all big roads. And then I also had some buffers as well. So this is the area. And then I had some initial walk along categories. I'll try and go through this quickly. So these were questions I was asking myself during the process. So I was interviewing myself during this. And so for my first walk, I was trying to think about what is my lived experience of illness and disability. So this can vary for each person. So trying to think of what is a good day, what is a bad day for me, what's an average day, and what are my access needs during those days. And then I also tried to consider what an everyday routine and personal care as it relates to built environment. How do I prepare for going for a walk or running errands in my neighborhood? And then I also looked at, during the walk, what are the barriers I'm encountering in the built environment? What are the supports that I have? Are there social supports in the built environment? Are there people I know in my neighborhood? Are there places I can go to? And how does that impact my well-being? And then I also wanted to consider how the weather and largely the climate crisis is impacting my experience of the built environment on different days. And then the seventh question would be like, what is my ideal community vision? Or for anyone doing this process, what would their ideal community look like? How would they change the design? And then any further thoughts, for example. So during my walks, I also was tracking the walks with a GPS system using an app called GPS Essentials, which was just tracking my route. I was taking photos along the walk, which would then have a geolocation with them. And then I was doing a video, or not a video, a voice recording, so an audio transcript of myself talking for notes, because it's easier for me. And then at the beginning and end of the walks, I would record the weather and if it had changed during the walk as well. And that would include barometric pressure, what are the conditions, humidity, and temperature. So what I learned from my initial walk is that it's a reiterative process for all these questions. So I was constantly confronting different barriers and supports. And then something that was interesting too is maybe there would be something that was supportive on one day and that was actually not supportive on another day, depending on the weather and how my access needs would change. And so I wanted to tweak the walk a bit so that it would be better for a repeated process. I wanted to look at different weather conditions and different types of places in my neighborhood. And I also wanted to create a symptom scale to track the differences with how I feel for each walk. So this is, I'm not going to go through all of this, but basically the idea here is akin to a pain scale, which I'm not a fan of, but I wanted to have a quantitative way of saying what is the range of my symptoms. And then I had a different, I also added descriptions that were based off of my experience of 0 being no symptoms, which I've never had no symptoms. And then 1 being minimal, and then 10 being unable to move, or 9 being severe, and a 5 being distracting, for example. So a 1 would be a little bit of fatigue, brain fog, hardly noticeable, can mostly get about my day. A 5, for example, would be I have many symptoms: fatigue, cognitive brain fog, lightheadedness, sensory sensitivity. I can't do some of the activities that require more exertion, walking for long distances, uphills, cardio exercise, for example. And then to a worse type of condition or severity on the scale would be severe at a 9. I can't think of anything other than how to reduce my symptoms, laying down, rehydration, cooling, temperature regulation. I have to stop in place and I have to sit if I've been standing to avoid syncope. So I found that this was helpful for comparing as it related to the different weather conditions or the length of walks, for example. So this is how I coded the concepts. I read through all of my transcripts of the different walks that I did. I looked at the maps and the photos that I took. I made sure the photos were related to the different geographic locations, and then also assigned that with the different points in the transcript of the walks too. And then I coded them. So I had a designed environment element, said if it was good or bad, so was it supportive or not? Was it a barrier? My symptoms, good or bad, and also the symptom scale. And then I have the typology in the built environment as well as the geographic location. And then lastly, I charted that. So then I also was looking at how that related to weather conditions and was I expressing any needs? For example, that could be, was I thirsty? Did I need a place to sit or lay down? Was I feeling like I needed to cool off or was too cold? Things like that, positives and negatives. So an example of this is part of the raw transcript, is it says, here's another alleyway. I think this is the one that connects and goes up. And then in brackets, it says walks for a bit. Okay, that isn't one of the alleyways that connects. This is really frustrating, as that means I need to walk back and I'm already feeling fatigued and that I need water and a place to rest. Okay, I think this is the actual street. Yes, it is. Chatham. Can't forget that. So I have a photo here of the actual alleyway. It's in the shade and there's a building, a brick building on the one side. It's not clearly marked. And I have another image of the actual route that I took. And I wasn't planning any of these walks. The alleyways in this neighborhood aren't clearly marked, unlike the roads themselves. And looking through all of the examples of the 6 different walks I took under various different weather conditions, I was able to come up with what were the design supports that I experienced and what was their likelihood of encountering them. And then what were the design barriers? And I looked at how they were either a barrier or a support for the different weather conditions. So for this first part, going through it, there's a sunny and thunderstorm condition. So those are typically conditions that are harder for someone who has dysautonomia and has temperature dysregulation and they dehydrate easily. And so a high albedo surface or transpiration surfaces. So transpiration meaning, was there greenery? Were there trees overhead? Were there perennials in particular? Sod or lawns, for example, were generally not helpful for helping me cool down. And so what are the impacts to the person? Cooling, sensory regulation. If there was less sound in the environment, it was generally less overwhelming. As someone who is overwhelmed by background noises, like loud streets, for example. And so the higher frequency of the design element is like, I often encountered light colored concrete walls in the shade, or cooling surfaces, grass in the shade for sitting. But the less likely things to encounter for lower frequency would be like trees, perennials, elevation changes in the shade. Sprinklers were very uncommon, for example. And so I'll make these available because I won't go through all of this for the sake of time. But looking on the barrier side, one thing that conversely I often encountered, but was worse under the conditions of high heat and thunderstorms, for example, is low albedo surfaces. So this would be dark colored surfaces that reflect heat onto someone. So this would be asphalt, concrete. And this creates this microclimate condition where it feels like you're in an easy bake oven almost. So it's reflecting onto you. and the symptoms it causes: overheating, dehydration, fatigue, breathing difficulties for myself. So examples that I often encounter were parking lots in full sun and bench seating in full sun, streets in full sun. So I'll make these available as well, and they're also accessible for reading through with a screen reader. And lastly, I converged these two things, the barriers and supports, to create preliminary recommendations. And I also thought about the frequency of the need. So I charted out, for example, like I said before, how often I needed water or a place to sit. And I also looked at what are the different weather conditions as it relates to the design element needed, and what is the impact level for myself in improving my accessibility to the built environment. And so the top of the chart shows like what would be the most impactful and how it relates to the different weather. So for example, sun, thunderstorms, for example, seating was a very important thing. And there isn't a high frequency of seating on areas outside of parks, which you have to get to the park, which can be difficult on a hot day if you're going down a street that doesn't have any shade and there's lots of concrete and asphalt and there's no place to sit in between. And sitting on a concrete curb isn't a great option and can often make a person overheat even faster. So there needs to be more options for seating in the shade, but also having places to sit between, like on the way to a park. So more little pop-up park areas would be ideal when there's a long slew of residential single-family homes in between. Or outside of an apartment building, there isn't an option either for seating because they don't have any frontage or public benches either because it's private land. So seating was a main one. Wayfinding, I said before with the example of the alleyway and that it wasn't clearly marked. That's very common throughout Hamilton in general. There's very little wayfinding and knowing if the alleyway will connect to two different streets. So often a person could be going down that road and then they'd have to turn back, and not great for someone who has limited stamina, and especially on a hot day and if there's no protection overhead from sun. And other needs are shade and cooling as well. Trees, cooling walls, perennials versus lawns would be helpful as well. Being thoughtful about where the shadow of buildings are, which is more of an urban planning level of design. Having increased access to water fountain. And then also having washrooms this is down low on the list because I didn't have frequent, there often wasn't a washroom available, and this is very likely throughout most Canadian cities, unfortunately, and it's also not often clearly marked, and that's a major problem. And it's often not open, or it's only open during certain times of the year, and you don't know if it's going to be accessible either. I created a walk-along interview tool for folks to use themselves or with groups, and I'll make this available as well. And then I envisioned this tool potentially being helpful for folks to create citizen data collection for their own communities. And I'm also curious about how this can be adapted for other groups, how this would be different in different locations, and a larger sample size, because this is exploratory research. And I think it would be a helpful tool for folks to understand their own access needs. And also any overlaps with folks who are COVID-19 survivors who also have autonomic nervous system changes as well, and how that will impact their access to the built environment as well.